Welcome to Relationship Talks, where we get to take a look at what goes on behind closed doors. I am your host, Laurie Brooke, the communication and conflict resolution coach and mediator, and the relationship architect for your relationships, helping you to design, create, and live relationships that you love. Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Relationships Talks, where we get to take a look at what goes on behind closed doors. I'm your host, Laurie Brooke, and today I am joined by Soslan Temanson.
Hello, I am Soslan Temanson, and I am so blessed and honored to be on a relationships advice podcast or a show to talk about my mistakes and I quote unquote say Soslan's red flags.
Soslan Temanson is a veteran of the United States Air Force. Soslan started a podcast called Remember God Loves You and I Will Meet You at the Finish Line, which discusses how to grow a relationship with God. He recently started to speak about sports and politics, and if you could write a book about red flags, Soslan would have his own bestseller of Soslie's 51 Red Flags on relationships. Welcome, Soslan, and thank you so much for joining me this morning, or I should say this evening for you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Now, I can see you're coming into me from the States. Whereabouts are you?
So I'm actually in Wisconsin. That's quite a bit of ways from Australia. And actually, I was stationed not too far from Australia. I was stationed in Tokyo, Japan. So that's the closest I got to Australia.
Stationed? You're in the Air Force, were you? Or?
So I was in the United States Air Force, yes.
Okay.
No, I'm no longer in the United States Air Force.
So tell me, I'm curious, when I put the call out and said, who wants to come on the show? And you put your hand up and said, yes, please, I want to come on. And we're talking about the past mistakes, the red flags that you have found for your relationships. What got you to this path?
Oh, so one of the biggest things that got me is that knowing that I think the biggest struggle that I've had is the insecurity of myself, and how, when you're, and when you're like, for instance, when you're born in Russia, or when you come from when you're adopted twice and stuff, you have some baggage that comes along with you. And so one thing that, I've kind of like, this is a common theme in my relationship where I'm always worried about the future, so for instance, my most recent couple of relationships before I'm like still single, I would talk about my future all the time. I'm like, hey, you know what? Why don't we talk about like how many kids we're going to have, what we're going to do, and all this, and what kind of jobs we're going to have, where we're going to live. And it kind of got like repetitive. But to me, I always wanted to make sure that, okay, what can I do to save for like our future? Well, what happened was I did not know that I was starting to get back in the old, trying to figure out, okay, I don't want to be in this situation. I don't want to be left on the street, and I don't want to like have something happen to me. So my insecurities got the best of me. That's talking about the future. So what happened was she's like, well, I don't want to really talk with you. Like, I don't think this is the right thing because, we weren't going out very much. Number one. Number two, I don't think she was starting to look for something else, but then I would always like not heed to her like signals. And like, when she's like, hey, you know what? She's like, hey, you know what? This is how I'm feeling, and you never asked about how my day was. And that's another thing that I found out is that my insecurity and I become another one was self-centeredness, and that got the best of me. And it's interesting because that has been my downfall in majority of my relationships.
Where do you think that all started from, Soslan?
Where the insecurities?
Yeah.
I would think, man, that's a good question. I think it started because when I was born in Russia, so here's a little bit of context. So when I was born in Russia, I was given up to an orphanage immediately. So I never got that motherly love. I never got that love and that compassion. And, that does something to you, I think, when you're a little kid, and then it kind of resonates with you because when you find somebody that you truly love, you don't want to lose them. You want to like jump forward to like the future immediately without, thinking in the now, and you're focused too much on the future. And that can be good and bad, but it turned out to be bad, and it turned out to be a very unhealthy relationship in my sense because I focused too much about it. And when you're adopted the second time, then you don't really know what's going to happen, because you're thinking, okay, what's going to happen now? Because, thinking about it, I'm like, man, um, is this family going to keep me and stuff? And, later down the road, or is my girlfriend going to keep me or something like that? How do I know that she's going to be committed to me? So if we talk about the future, then you can kind of pressure her to thinking, okay, well, I don't want to let her down because we already got something we've been talking about the future. And those, to me, that's been one of the hardest breakups is that when you talk about the future and she talked about like, okay, she agrees with you and stuff, she kind of goes along with it. And then she separates it. That is the hardest for me. It's like, oh man, I thought we had something, you know, I thought we are committed and I thought we're like for the long run, but I guess not. And it's like it took a toll on me a couple times.
So, what have you done to try and work on your insecurities to get past all of that?
I would I would have to say that's a work in progress.
Yeah.
Um, it's a work in progress, and this kind of brings me to another red flag of mine, which is talking about being content with yourself and just being who you are. Because I feel like so many of us when we are on the date or when we go like introduce a woman or introduce ourselves to like somebody else, we want to kind of put a facade, a facade of like who like we want to be. And sometimes more so I've and you know what? The only reason I'm telling about this is because I've done it. I'm not telling like, hey, this is what to look out for. No, I've done this. And I tell people all the time, I fell into that trap. And it's hard because for instance, I'm going to use an example. Um, when I was when I was in the hospital, all right, and I was talking to a couple girls and stuff, or to a couple people. I should say like women. I gotta stay away from girls because that can be mixed and stuff. I was talking to a couple women my age, and they would ask what you do. Now, for a person that's in an acute rehab facility, majority of us don't want to say, "Hey, I'm in an acute rehab facility." And no, most of us, dude, I was not comfortable stating that I was in an acute rehab facility. So what I would say is like, well, I'm busy, I'm working, and they're like, well, so what do you do for work? And I'm like, well, I'm in the United States Air Force, and then I left it there, you know, and then they're like, well, do you want to like, with gadgets these days, they wanted to FaceTime, and so I would kind of like heat off of FaceTiming, and then and then they kind of asking a little bit more questions. And then, when you're on Snapchat, you have like Snapchat locations, and then you have like Facebook and all that. And when people like would post photos, like non-family members, they would ask about it. And then right there and then, like another huge thing, that facade all suddenly crumbles like a glass piano. Like what we discussed is that, when we begin a relationship, it's like a beautiful grand piano, a beautiful glass, majestic. And that's how it should be. But what happened was I took a wrecking ball to it. And now that girl's gonna say, okay, well, how can I really trust you? How are you not gonna put up a barrier or even a facade to make yourself look like big as you are, but you're really not. And so it was interesting because I've struggled with that as well. And so, I think that also deals with the insecurities of myself, because I don't want to let people down and I want to like have them I want to keep on that relationship and have that relationship so they don't, it's harder for them to leave me and stuff because, it kind of does more of not damage, but it makes them feel more pity on them, if they
Yeah.
do. And
So,
so,
what do you think you've learned from all of this?
oh, what do I, oh, boy, that's another good question. Man, you're coming out with good questions. Um, Man, one thing I have learned is really not, is being happy with who you are.
We're just going to take a quick break now, so don't go anywhere. Make sure you stick around and join us for the rest of our conversation. If you haven't already, make sure you grab a copy of my ebook, It's Time to Stop the Overwhelm, giving you practical and actionable tips that you can implement right away to create happier and healthier relationships.
You know, it's being content with what you have. And it's being afraid of not being afraid of telling, people like, hey, you know what? I have some obstacles I face on a daily thing. When a person has FND, which is functional neurological disorder, but it's an obstacle. Like each and every single one of us face an obstacle. It's being happy with it and say, okay, how can we work with that? And also it's how do we keep ourselves accountable, and how do we keep ourselves like making sure that we don't build a facade, because that facade can always be, there's nothing to that facade besides our BS. Some people can just walk right through it.
Yeah.
And so it's for me, it would also have to for me, it would just have to be accountability, and making sure, I kind of like it's harder for it's harder for somebody for me to like talk to somebody.
Yeah. I think it's, I mean, one thing that people might not know about you is, and you did allude to it before, is that you did suffer an injury
Yeah.
and that has carried through.
Well, because not well, and another thing is, when you look at like especially at 24, when you look at these young individuals like at my age and stuff, I'm not going to say, hey, I suffered, I had a major illness that paralyzed me for about 3 months, and then I had to spend 6 months in the acute rehab facility. And yeah, there we go. And they're like, well, why don't you have a job? And so that's what you kind of have to like, for me. And so that's why that facade, and that's why like thinking, okay, you know what? Um, this is why I'm building, like, you build up barriers, and it's harder for you to kind of break down those barriers and just being happy. Because if you tell somebody, and there are some people actually, a couple weeks ago, where I told them like briefly, hey, here's what happened and stuff, and they left for they dashed out like it was Black Friday. They like made a Macy truck drove by saying 100% off. And I was telling them about, hey, you know what, this is going on. And what happened is that they darted for that Macy's truck, and it's sad because now it's something that, there's ramifications to what happened to my illness and stuff. There's ramifications. So if something happens like 10 or 15 years down the road, and I'm with somebody or even married, well, the bigger question is, and adverse reaction happens to it and stuff, then they're going to say, okay, well, you never told me about this. You never told me about, I thought you were just in the Air Force, and I thought you just got out at 24 years old, and did something else with your career. I thought you did all this. You didn't tell me this whole thing. And that's where that whole trust issue, um, that's where that integrity and that trust issue just plays in line now. And then that's a lot harder for you guys to have a healthy relationship without the other half doubting or always having second thoughts, stating whether if you are being honest or if the things that you say is credible, and she's always going to be now willing to go into somebody else, not you, because now she will no longer believe in your word.
Mm. But equally, I think that trust goes both ways, like you being able to
True.
trust that they will accept you for who you are and love you
Yeah.
for who you are and want to be with you despite everything else, because you don't trust what she's saying is true. And so you're looking for the evidence as to why it isn't true. And then you're using that and saying, right, these are my reasons as to why I don't believe you.
Mhm.
Do you ever feel like there is capacity to believe someone on face value of what they're saying?
Like in a relationship, or like if they
Yeah.
mess up the time?
Just in a relationship in general. I mean, I think most people in some capacities embellish little things here and there. I had the worst day ever, and really maybe one or two things went wrong that day. It wasn't the worst
Yeah.
day ever. But at that particular point in time, that's what we like to say. I just wonder how much is it, people just embellishing little bits, and you.
Well, I mean, I would have to say all of us kind of do that, don't we? Even with our
Yeah.
friends, we
Yeah.
all do that. Um, and even I mean, I'm not calling the kettle black. I follow in that trap like each and every day. I am guilty as honor. I am guilty as charged. Throw me in an old slam, but at the same time, you know, you can try to embellish it, but it also has to do with your body language. and it also has to deal with your demeanor, and also it has to deal with what you're trying to, what are you trying to get out of this? Excuse me. And so if the significant other is like continually doing it, then you're not going to be very interested,
Okay.
and then you're gonna be more busy on catching her trying to embellish two things too much, and then that drive and that companionship, which is, I want to kind of touch into that companionship versus affectionate relationship. Um, that companionship kind of gets fragile and then it gets damaged, and it's like that glass piano that we talked about in the
Mm,
beginning, where that embellishment is like, okay, over time, but eventually once you guys lead into it, well, that's eventually when you guys lead into it, then it's, and leads into marriage, then you have to be open and transparent. But in the beginning stages of relationship, that's kind of like it's kind of a, it just happens, and a lot of us don't really touch base on it. Like there's a thing called affectionate relationship versus a companionship
yep.
relationship. And so there's multiple with that embellishment and even with that deception a little bit. Majority of the guys I'm seeing, if they're willing to put embellishment and like embellishment and kind of fabricate on what they had kind of the day they had. And anyway, if they had like a really bad day, then and then that girl's like, "Hey, how did you like? How's your day and stuff?" He's like, "Oh, it's fantastic and stuff." And then they're like, "Well, let's go out to dinner," and then the rest is history. But without the guy knowing that he had a really bad day and that he might have had his job fired and that he doesn't want to tell, and all he was worried about was getting making sure the fireworks go off, you know. And so what happened is then the next morning, then the guy has to answer to thing, saying, "Well, why didn't you tell me that you lost your job? Why didn't you tell me you had a bad day? We didn't have to do this." It turns into an affectionate relationship, and that turns into a toxicity relationship. Unlike a companionship relationship, where, for instance, if I had a bad day and I came home from work and I'm like, "Hey, you know what? I had a bad day. Can we just sit down and talk?" And that's what a good relationship is about. And she's like, "Okay, well, let's go out to dinner. Let's talk it over dinner and stuff." And then things kind of turn for the good. Well, I'm not going to go home and make fireworks go off. I'm going to make sure we go home and watch a movie and call it a night, because I know that I have to go either to work next tomorrow morning, or I have to do something else. And then it shows that woman and it shows the other half saying, "Okay, you know what? I can trust this person, because this person is truly authentic about what he has, and that he's not about sex. That's where a companionship. That's why I push for companionship, because it's like your best friend, you know, but it's on the other, different sex, or it might be same sex. You guys, it's like that, where you're comfortable with each other and you're open and transparent. And it's not only you, but it's the other half. And it's also up to, for instance, it's up to me to ask the girlfriend or boyfriend how their day was.
Yep.
It's up to my side as well. So it plays both sides. It's not only one side. You're not expecting somebody to come home and say, "Oh, how's your day?" "Oh, great," and then you just brush it off and say, "Hey, let's go for dinner." No, you ask and say, "Well, how's your day? What all happened with your day? Did anything exciting happen?"
Yeah.
And see, it allows that transparency. Sorry for
But I
talking too
think
much.
no, I think that also then plays into how you listen to someone when
Yeah,
they tell you
amen.
about their day.
Uh, yeah, amen.
Don't go away. I will be right back finishing the conversation just after this. If you are looking for ways to improve, enhance, and take your relationship to the next level, make sure you check out our online program, Improving Your Relationships. Don't stay where you are. Do the work, create your own happiness, and move forward with happier and healthier relationships.
And you have to listen. And I mean, once again, I'm guilty as charged, because that is another barrier of a red flag, major red flag in Saucy's. Saucy's red flags. And it would have to be my top 5, is I failed to listen. And how I fail to listen is my body language. And how I fail to listen is, like, for instance, um, if I'm going to sit down and my girlfriend or the other half comes up to me and says, "Hey, can we talk?" I'm like, "Absolutely." And then what I do is I pull out my phone and just start to, like, playing like Clash Royale or something like that. And then she's talking. I'm like, "Uh-huh. Okay." And then I kind of scroll through, like, kind of have my phone off, but turn down the brightness, and then just kind of scroll through, and then not really listening to her, but thinking like, "Uh-huh. Oh, wow. Okay, cool." No, and then because that's very easy readable. Because then she asks, "Well, what do you think? What do you think I should do?" And you're like, "Oh, I tell you the truth." And then you then have to say, "Well, I wasn't really paying attention." That's like that destroys something. It destroys a relationship. And I've had that happen, and I've been that person where I didn't really listen. I asked, "Hey, I didn't know what you just said." As kind of a smart remark. And there's no way of rebounding. You just have to suck it up and take it. And I've also been as a receptor or as an individual where I spoke with somebody and either the girl was not interested or she was like, yeah. And then she's like, yeah. And then she's starting to, and I'm like, are you listening at all to what I had to say? And then, and then she's like, well, here and there. And that's like, okay, well, what's the point of me like laying out how I feel if you're not going to listen?
I think what I wanted to do at this point, Soslan, is just to go over, I suppose, the different points, because you've raised so many points as to the mistakes and red flags that you've come across in your past relationships.
Yes.
And so as you've been talking, I've been writing a list. And so I have here, number one was the insecurities and being too future focused, not being focused on the here and now and creating that relationship from the ground up, but worried about what's going to happen in the future.
Yep.
Then you talked about not being truthful and having that facade. And I think that linked back to the insecurities because it had to do with you personally as to your circumstances at that particular point in time. But I think for everyone else, there is that real key there is that they're going to find out if you're hiding something, they're going to find out. So just be honest about it from the get-go.
Yep.
So you don't break down that dishonesty. And then we talked about the communication and the listening and making sure that, you are creating a relationship that's based on companionship from the ground up, being
Yep.
somebody's friend and companion and actually wanting to support them, grow together as a couple. And not one person pushing the relationship on the other, because that's never going to create a healthy relationship.
Yep.
If you had to give one key takeaway in everything that you've been through with relationships, what is it that you're going to do differently next time?
Wow. So one thing I'm going to do differently is is when I first introduce myself, it's just be happy with who I am. It's just being happy with who you are and just being happy of thinking, okay, you know what? You know, not putting a facade, not embellishing, not just being like that, but like, hey, you know what? I am Soslan Temanson. And you know what? And here's what I have to not offer, but here's what I've been through, some of the struggles I've been through. So it's kind of like you give what you say, like you give like some of the things, and then it's kind of like you say, okay, you're gonna take it or leave it. It's kind of a bad way of thinking it, but it's kind of like that metaphorically. Here's what it is. You take it or leave it. Or let's do something with it. And and then we'll see what happens with that. So I think it's just being who you are, and being the true you, because a lot of us and getting that rid of embellishment and getting rid of that facade kind of a little facade personality out of all of us and just being happy.
Thank you so much for joining me
No
today,
problem.
Soslan. Have a wonderful evening. And thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Relationship Talks. If you can, I would love for you to jump on and leave a review. And whilst you are at it, don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please join me again next week when we get to take a look behind closed doors at someone else's relationship. But until then, I am your host, Laurie Brooke, and remember the choice is yours, so make today and the week the very best it can be.